He never had an intention of being humble, being accountable.
To learn it so on purpose, I think, is something that's going to light up people's brains. To me, that's like the key that unlocks everything. Couples counseling is one of those really difficult things that I know everybody who is in an abusive or toxic relationship has either done or considered at some point, thinking that it's going to help, thinking that you're having relationship issues or you're having disagreements or that you both need to work on things. But in my experience, couples counseling has been dangerous, and I've seen a lot of really negative outcomes. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Peter Salerno, and we're going to talk about the different things you might see in couples counseling. And if you've ever done it, I'm sure you'll see yourself in this episode. But first, I would like to properly introduce my guest. So, Dr. Salerno, can you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Sure. I am a psychotherapist, and predominantly my career has been focused on personality disorders and trauma. So I've specialized in both of those. I've written a few books. I've written a book about narcissism and the nature-nurture debate, and I tried to debunk some myths in that book related to what a lot of popular media portrays as narcissism that I think is inaccurate based on the research. I've also coined a term called traumatic cognitive dissonance to explain the type of dissonance that occurs through intentional manipulation in relationships. And then I recently released a book called Cruelty by Nature, which talks about the science of intentional abuse. And predominantly now I counsel people and consult with individuals who are coming out of relationships with individuals who have severe personality pathology, and they're trying to make sense of what happened in those contexts. And I think we'll probably cover a lot of that today.
Absolutely. And as a quick aside, those books are phenomenal. I've read them all, and I really recommend that people read those, especially if you're considering couples counseling with someone who is abusive or toxic or disordered. That'll definitely be some education that you need prior to going in. Why don't we kind of start with what have you seen in couples settings if you're working with someone? I feel like it's a little unfair because you're a specialist in this, so you probably can spot the disorders more than your average therapist. But what do you think it is when couples sit down? What's the intention that most couples are trying to achieve in therapy that just isn't going to work if someone's disordered?
Yeah, well, so if somebody's disordered in the dyad, in the treatment unit, what happens is the therapist, and it's not necessarily their fault. If they're not trained in personality pathology, they wouldn't know what to look for here. So I'm not saying anything disparaging about therapists, but it's important to talk about this because there's a lot of inadvertent harm that can be extremely damaging. The therapist might be assuming that both people in the couple's dyad are showing up to collaborate to solve problems, and that they both have collaborative capacity and a willingness to solve problems, right? That's the first major problem, is assuming mutual collaboration. So when somebody with a personality disorder is in the mix, you can't assume collaboration with them. And one of the reasons is because they don't collaborate to solve problems in a relationship. They try to make it so that one person is right and the other is wrong. Right. And so the idea of going to therapy to resolve problems kind of goes out the window if one person's intention is simply to be right, and to be confirmed in their ways versus trying to exercise humility, understanding, compassion, empathy, those types of things. They don't actually show up in a relationship with a disordered personality because their motivation is really just to be the one who is not problematic and to externalize all of the blame. So a couple showing up to couples therapy to resolve problems, it's not going to happen if there's a personality disorder in the mix.
I love the directness of that. It's not going to happen, people. I wish someone had told me that, to be honest. When I did counseling, I did not know that I was sitting beside a disordered person, nor did I have any clue about disorders. So I would never have known. I am so lucky that the therapist has some level of knowledge and training and absolutely spotted it. But that's not what I see. So what you're talking about is so much more common in what I hear about from my clients who've either done it or are doing it in conjunction working with me. But the therapist might see this person talking about their side of things and ask the victim of abuse, not recognizing that they're a victim, you need to be more communicative, or have you ever tried spending more time together, or frankly, like having more sex? Have you tried? It pushes the victim to start to consider the ways that they're causing their own abuse.
Yes, absolutely. And everything you just described is the therapist assuming collaboration, right? You don't get a degree in psychology and you're typically not taught that somebody's going to show up like not to try to correct problems. What you think is people are showing up and they're investing their time and their money to heal or to get help. And unfortunately, that's just not the case with these disordered people because they don't solve problems the way normal people solve problems. The way they solve problems is they try to escalate drama and externalize blame. And they actually end up creating more problems and sustaining old ones when they go to therapy. Another thing that's really detrimental is the therapy modalities for couples are designed to validate both perspectives. So a lot of therapists are validating abuse without knowing it because they're not seeing the signs or looking for the tells or even understanding the countertransference, which is kind of what they're supposed to pick up on and feel and react to when somebody is being deceptive and when somebody's feigning collaboration. There's just not a lot of formal training in that. And so the likelihood of going to therapy and finding somebody who is well-versed in that is, at this point, it's unlikely. What you're going to see is that they're going to try to conceptualize these abusive behaviors either as trauma reactions or somebody who's really trying but just can't, and so you can teach them.
Right.
That's just not the case.
He's trying part. Oof.
Yeah. A lot of framing of like, these are just negative interactive patterns, and if I can just steer you in the right direction, all of this will be resolved. Not factoring in that some of these people don't want to give up the abuse they're inflicting because it's working for them. And that's a foreign concept to your average therapist.
I agree with you so much. I've gone live before and I've seen therapists in the comments of my lives, but this is multiple times. And if I say things, and I try to be respectful, I'm a coach. I'm not here to really discuss what therapists learn in their programs because I know it's different and it's not all the same. But like fundamentally, I hear repetitiously from so many psychologists and therapists that collectively, as broadly speaking, you're not trained in the programs about personality disorders and whatnot. So I'm thinking of several recent examples where therapists were like, this is not true. We are trained. We absolutely are. You're wrong. And I think like perhaps you were trained, but to think that broadly speaking, therapists have a deep understanding. I mean, my proof is just in that I'm not seeing that. And I've just heard from too many therapists. And again, we're not attacking therapists. This is maybe an issue with the education system and the programs that are being run. I think it's nice that you would assume that everybody in front of you is here willingly and wanting to collaborate. I wish that maybe there was more training on how to assess levels of willingness to be collaborative first in some capacity. Is that like when you sit down with a couple, is that what you're doing? You're immediately sort of looking for a lack of collaboration?
I'm not necessarily looking for it, but I'm highly aware of the possibility that it could exist. And so I don't have this confirmation bias that you both shown up and you're doing your best. I just don't think that way. Now, a lot of people say that's cynical or skeptical, but I believe it's a therapist's job to be a bit skeptical because we are scientists before we're advocates. That seems to really not resonate with a lot of people. Maybe it sounds harsh, but the people who are coming to you because they can't solve their problems on their own. So you can't expect them to know exactly what's going on. So you do have to be a little bit like, well, maybe not all of this is true. This is, they're bringing their psychology to you, right? Even in relationships though, especially in long-term committed relationships, the person who's being abused shouldn't go into the relationship thinking, gosh, I wonder if I'm going to get totally like hoodwinked and duped and sucker punched in about 10 years. Like, why would you even enter into it if you thought that was a possibility? So it's also just kind of like human nature doesn't really give a lot of room to this possibility that someone's going to be problematic in a way where there's not a way to repair it. But unfortunately, with these individuals, the way that they're wired, the way that they're motivated, they like to blow things up rather than, create an understanding and a resolution.
Yeah, they definitely love problems. I actually remember a couple of different things. We had 2 different couples counselors over the years. And the first one essentially made me never want to do it again, even though we later did. But the first one, it was very like, okay, you guys have communication issues. Really, all issues in marriages and in relationships all come down to communication. I remember him saying that so clearly. And my abuser communicated that he felt like there was a lack of respect, that I didn't respect him. Now, in hindsight, I absolutely did not. but I had reason to. But we never got that far. And it just turned into, I'm not respectful enough. And how can I show more respect? Respect is obviously very important to him, so that would help. And I'm sitting here thinking, what does that mean? And I mean, I have whole opinions and probably a whole topic for another episode on what abusive men deem as respect to begin with. And my take in my relationship was that it was more compliance, I would say, than anything, just blind agreement and, blind loyalty and trust for no reason. But it really, I left that after 5 or 6 sessions, just like, I cannot sit here for one more week and be told that this is my fault. Like something's off. And I didn't know what, and I didn't know it was abuse. And we need to talk about that. We don't know that this is abuse. So many people say, don't go into couples counseling if you're in an abusive relationship. But I'm sure you agree, most people don't know that they're in an abusive relationship. So if I don't have the language to label it as abuse, I'm not going to know to seek out a therapist who understands abuse, or to not do this at all, or to seek out a therapist who understands personality disorders. You're just going in thinking, man, my partner seems really angry, or we seem to constantly be misunderstanding each other. We read the book, The 5 Love Languages, and I think we're just speaking different languages. This is what brings people in. So it makes it impossible to get anywhere in therapy.
Yeah, it's a big misconception that communication is one of the main problems in relationships, especially these relationships. Communication is not the problem. The problem is there's one person that's perceiving something in a very disordered way, and they're not going to let go until you, as you said, submit and comply. That's what the therapy ends up becoming about. The problem is a therapist who's looking at a human being in front of them and seeing someone who is seemingly, they're showing up, right? They're going to validate the abuse. And again, like you said, if the client who's being abused doesn't even know they're being abused, because we've historically defined abuse as like physical bruises on the skin, or things that are visible, or things that you can be convicted of a crime for. There's all kinds of abuse that are just as damaging, that are hidden, concealed, and invisible. And it's a very dangerous situation to give a disordered person the ammunition from therapy to have all of these new words, like, whatever it may be, like the validation and boundaries and dismissal and respect and mutual and all this stuff. And, I have the right to this and this and this because, the therapist said you have to respect my boundaries and all this stuff. It all gets weaponized. So that language just ends up increasing and expanding their toolkit of abuse, right?
I remember sitting at my kitchen table one night, and it was 4 o'clock in the morning because woke me up in the middle of the night to pick a fight. And we were in therapy. And this was with the therapist who recognized what was going on years later. And he was like, okay, so red-green exercise. This is what she taught me. And he provoked me to get me into the red. And then he was like, go green right now. Do it. Go green. And I'm like, what exercise is this? What are you talking about? And he was like, that's what she said. You have to go green when you're red. So do it. I was like, I am quite confident that she didn't put you in the red zone and then just scream, go green in your session with her. Because we did some solo sessions. I don't even know what this is. I've Googled it. I've never heard of this red-green exercise. I'm sure it came from somewhere, but I'm sure that it was, I want to say twisted, but really, warped into something else. But that's to me, a wild example of how you learn something in therapy and then they weaponize it. I am sure she didn't mean wake your girlfriend or wife up in the middle of the night, drag them out of bed by their feet and scream at them in the kitchen. It's crazy. These are the crazy things that can happen. But maybe on a less crazy level, what do you commonly see when you are sitting with a couple? Because you know what you're doing, you get this, you've seen it, you might have a different perspective, but what do you think you are seeing that others are not seeing?
I think the main thing is, we kind of touched on it earlier, but I'm not going to assume that the two people that are coming into the therapy are knowing exactly what's wrong. But oftentimes, it's no fault of their own, but they're going to speak their truth, their experience. There's ways to tell when somebody is feigning collaboration. And one of the easiest things, I've gotten a lot of heat for this in the past because it seems like it's oversimplified, but a lot of times these individuals will go and they'll be model therapy clients, the disordered person. They will go do the assignments, they will do the homework, they will practice it. They will remind their partner, we need to do this, They'll report back the teacher's pet, and they'll act like everything is but they don't realize that they're giving themselves away in a lot of subtle ways. One of the things is, if they were really doing all of those things in a sincere way and the other person was receiving it sincerely, it would feel safe. That's something that's really big. It would feel safe. It doesn't feel safe when someone just like goes through the motions to look like they're like a model client. And they do a really good job of making it seem like they're really in it here to like work it out. There's inevitable contradictions and inconsistencies in disordered people that they're not even aware that they're giving up. So those are some things that you really need to kind of like zero in on and sort of inspect and investigate or notice. Something that's really important, that's absolutely useful, and it requires a lot of skill and training, and it's not necessarily something that comes naturally, is reading like the countertransference. Like, what are the emotional reactions that the therapist is having towards each individual? Those things, there's not like a universal way to experience a narcissist or an abusive person, but there are like things that give it away that there's something off. And I think people need to pay more attention to that. What happens usually is if that comes up with an average therapist, they'll dismiss it outright and go back to the unconditional positive regard for the person rather than confronting this and saying, this is coming up for good reason. Like, why am I feeling dread all of a sudden when this person is supposed to be collaborating? That's really important data. You can get to the point where you can be really skilled and accurate in assessing what that is. Then there comes the problem of therapists, they want to help. So it doesn't always feel good to confront that right in the here and now. A lot of therapists aren't willing to say that this person is full of it and then call that out. Also, you have to be careful if you do that because that could potentially put the victim in more danger. There's so many subtleties to this, and it's really kind of hard to explain like right here on the fly when I'm not like in the room with somebody like this. Right. But I just want to say there are so many ways to get really good and skilled at learning when somebody is just simply not collaborating. Another thing is a lot of people have, I think we went over this with Dr. George Simon, they have incongruent affect. They might tell a sob story or a trauma story, but it's incongruent with what they're actually experiencing inside and then what the other person is experiencing. Like if somebody's in a lot of pain, it's natural to feel empathy for them or compassion for them, right? But if somebody's telling a painful story and that's not lighting up in you, you want to wonder about that. This person is saying all the right things. They were abused as a kid. They were traumatized. They have an insecure attachment. Their father never paid attention to them. That's why they have to be this way, etc. And then it doesn't really add up emotionally. Something's not congruent. It takes years to kind of fine tune like how to trust yourself to know what's going on. And there's not always words for it. But all that is to say, there's a lot of things that you have to simultaneously pay attention to when you're in the room. And you have to be careful what you say and what you don't say because you never want to endanger the victim further. And that inadvertently happens a lot.
We got fired in ours. And I say that like I love this woman for firing us because the violence, which had, I'm going to say paused. I would have said stopped, but paused is a better word. It paused and then it started to get worse. The dragging me out of bed by my feet stuff started happening while in therapy and yet living separately. So she was like, the danger is increasing. So I'm going to need to halt all of this. We cannot continue. You are not safe. And that was a really hard conversation to hear because I was like, wait a minute, like you need to help us. What do you mean? You can't fire us. What happens then? And I mean, I think in hindsight, like, well, you get safe and they separated. That was kind of the point, but it made it so much worse. And I think that's something that people don't seem to understand when they're like, but I just want to try. I think it's hard to even know what kind of advice to give to a survivor or a victim that wants to go into this sort of knowing, because I deal with, and I'm sure you do too, people who know that or believe that this person is disordered, but they certainly know that they're abusive or toxic in a lot of the cases by the time I see them. So they go into it somewhat knowing that they're going in with a disordered person or an abusive person, but they don't seem aware of how much worse it can get and how abuse can really escalate if they feel cornered or attacked by. Because on one hand, it's really validating for the survivor to be like, yeah, the therapist sees it and agrees. But what happens when a disordered or abusive person feels like 2 against 1 in a therapy setting?
Dangerous. I used to have, trainees working under my license. And so, they had clients. And the way that works is you're the supervisor, they're the supervisee. So they see the client, but they're technically my client, right? Because they're working under my license. And I had this person and she was working with a couple and the guy was absolutely disordered based on what she was revealing to me. Something that was really dangerous that happened. And again, I'm not saying anything disparaging, but we need to get the word out, to alert people of this. Her way to help the victim was to help her get more in touch with her boundary setting. So She encouraged her to go home and set firm boundaries with this guy. And then the guy hit her.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's not that the woman had weak boundaries. It's that the woman intuitively knew if she sets them, she's going to get hurt. So to try to empower or encourage somebody to set boundaries with an abusive person is only going to escalate the abuse. You have to be careful what you tell the victim to do, right? You're not even supposed to really tell them, what specifically to do. That, I think, was a kind of a rookie mistake, but it could have been a fatal one, depending on how malignant this person was, right? So it's understanding the bigger picture here. Not everything's co-created, right? Some people are just not operating in the relationship in a collaborative way, right? And then you need to kind of know what the person is capable of. And the way you do that is you ask the right questions and you get the right data and you kind of get a feel for the person. It's just really, really important to get specialized training. And again, you can't predict who's going to come to your office as a therapist, right? You take a referral, you're ethically obligated to, get the referral. But once you start to notice that maybe like these problems are getting worse or, this isn't really like two people just trying to come together to resolve it, you have to either refer out to a specialist or you need to kind of say, I don't know if I'm the best fit for you. I'm going to try to find somebody else. I mean, it's complicated on all sides, right? It's like, it's not just that therapist sucked or this kind of a thing. There's so many variables that are hard to control. But I think what's most important, and I think what you're trying to do is you can't just go to like any average therapist and expect that they're going to understand this. And unfortunately, I think now there's more responsibility on clients to do more searching for the right type of help. Like really be clear on what the profile and the biography of the therapist is telling you. If they believe that there's no such thing as disorder and everybody deserves unconditional regard and it's just a matter of misunderstanding and you're being abused or you think you might be being abused, but you're not necessarily calling it that, I would keep searching. That's not a profile that is telling me that they are going to confront abuse in an appropriate way.
I remember, interviewing the therapist prior to, and I remember asking her, do you have experience working with people who just like argue? And the consult was alone. I was by myself. So I had a little bit more freedom, but I would never have said abuse, not even the word toxic, in fact. But I remember saying to her, do you have any experience with people where like, I just feel like I'm wrong all the time and I'm constantly in trouble and I feel afraid and like nervous to be wrong. And in hindsight, I sounded like somebody who's with somebody disordered, I suppose. But what I was really trying to ask was like, can you help me? But I feel like I may have been lucky a little bit that I had some shreds of language, but ultimately I didn't go in and say like, do you have experience working with people who are in abusive relationships? My partner is a narcissist. I would never know that. So it is so important to get the right therapist. And yet we don't know what that is. So you look, even if you know if it's abuse or you think it's disordered, you look it up. And I feel like you can click anything on Psychology Today and say that you have experience. But how do you really know that the therapist knows what they're talking about? I feel like you need to be in the room and then who knows what happens at that point.
It's just like the field of medicine, right? Like all doctors go to medical school and they pass their exams and they do their residency. But there's a really distinct difference from like a psychiatrist and an oncologist. But we call them doctors. And so somebody can just call anyone up and say, oh, my internal medicine doctor has a medical degree. They can prescribe psychotropic meds. I wouldn't recommend going to your internal medicine doctor for those types of meds, even though they can legally prescribe them. I would go to someone who went, further into specializing in what those meds do, because there's a lot of people who get thrown on an antidepressant when they have PTSD from abuse and their doctor said, oh, you probably just have some anxiety. Go take this. It's the same thing with therapy. There's no such thing as you get a degree, you pass your exams, and then you know everything about psychology. And you shouldn't, and no one should expect you to. So I give this example a lot. I have no business being in a room with somebody with autism or schizophrenia. I learned about those things. I studied them. I legally, when you're a licensed therapist, you can legally diagnose them. Should you, if you haven't specialized? Absolutely not. I don't think that you have any business doing that. So look for people who's like have like a paper trail, if you will, of training, specifically pathological abuse relationships, pathological, romantic relationships. There's phrases now where people will put on their profiles that, you need to pay attention to related to this type of thing. Unfortunately, you mentioned Psychology Today. When you're creating a Psychology Today profile as a therapist, you get the option to check all boxes on what you treat. And it's really just as simple as maybe I'll get more clients if I check more boxes. So they could very well the personality disorder box. A lot of therapists think personality disorders are just another way of saying trauma disorders or attachment disorders. So they lead you into thinking that they know exactly what you're dealing with. And unfortunately, it might just be that they thought, oh yeah, I read about those in school. I could check that box too, because I technically learned about it.
Yeah.
Again,
Narcissist, sure, I could do that.
I'm not trying to disparage, the field. I'm just saying there's a lot of things that it's important to look for. And it's hard to find good help in this realm. I think there's incredible help for all kinds of other mental conditions and issues. But you also just got to think about just pragmatically, two people coming together because they can't figure out why they're making each other miserable. They would typically sincerely want to stop feeling miserable. Personality disorders, they don't want to stop feeling miserable because they don't necessarily feel miserable. They just make people miserable, right?
Big distinction. Yes. And I mean, they like it to a degree. Like they like the chaos and the drama, even though they tell you your drama and your chaos and they hate it. But like, that's not really what's going on. So it's hard. Yeah, I can only imagine. In therapy, I feel like what makes it dangerous is a variety of things. Obviously, we're talking about you leave therapy and he goes and hits you or something or like worse. But I think even the lessening of emotional safety but the therapist said that you have to be more respectful like that. And then you're only deepening this and you get more confused, more invalidated and less likely to leave. Like I had wanted to write this man a letter. I found out he was retired. So I skipped it because thank goodness he's retired. But it occurred to me like, I want to tell you that you made me stay. I just wanted him to know. He could never have responded. It was fine. I just felt compelled to say, you made me stay in an abusive relationship. And he went on to do some things that could have cost me my life because you didn't pick up on it. And maybe that's not fair. I'm not saying that what I felt was fair, but I just was like, you should know what you did and that you missed the point. I don't think he understood how I was feeling in the room. What do you think survivors and victims are feeling when they're sitting there watching their abuser DARVO in therapy or, victim blame in therapy?
Well, I think a true victim, because, obviously personality disorders feign being victims. And listen, I know we're having an interview here, so I can't go into all the nuances. I'm not denying that a lot of people with personality disorders do have histories of adversity. The science shows that adversity isn't what actually is causing the personality disorder. But there's a difference between a victim who's experiencing what you just described, DARVO or those types of things. There's a sincere terror and bewilderment as to what's going on. They really don't know what's going on. Victims typically don't go around labeling their partners as narcissists or abusers because like you said, oftentimes they don't even know that they're being abused. So you want to look for that too. Like somebody who's really sincerely confused about what's going on. I think that also identifies, who the true victim is. The people who feign being victims are often quick to point fingers and externalize blame. And sometimes they do it without knowing it because they do it so habitually, they just kind of give themselves away. But there's a lot of ways to identify somebody being coerced, somebody being, forced into submission, somebody who is really just in anguish inside. You can pick up on that. And there's a difference between that and somebody who is trying to win favor with the therapist or make a good impression. And there's something missing underneath that a real victim would actually be, holding deeply.
I know there's a lot of nuance to that. Like I'm thinking, I remember one of the things that our therapist said to me in a solo private setting. She said that she noticed that I deferred to him. She would ask us a question and I would immediately what do you think? You answer, you go ahead, you talk, you say what's your issue. And again, I'm not saying that she thinks that's the number one thing, but she just noticed that and she perceived it, and I would say correctly, as a lack of safety on my part
to
actually speak. So if it was well, what are your issues with him? I'm I'm fiddling with my hair, quite literally, because I was nervous. So she picked up on that. But I think some victims, true victims of abuse, I don't mean the ones playing it, you're in therapy and you may be, I think it's probably a smaller category, but it exists, I'm sure. You've watched all the videos. You know who Dr. Peter Salerno is. You follow Lisa Sonni on social media. You know he's a narcissist. You just convicted and you get him into couples therapy because you haven't heard this episode yet. And you're like, he's a narcissist. I know you're not speaking broadly or you're not speaking generally this covers every single scenario.
No.
But I do know what you mean. Most victims go into it sort of truly bewildered was the perfect word. Just absolutely like, what the hell is going on here? Why are we always fighting? Why is this always so hard? You really, like, they're so interested in self-reflection. Like, really tell me, what am I doing that's making this be this way? Because he says it's my fault and I want to do better. I just know that women sit in these meetings and they don't recognize that it's abuse and they don't understand what the hell's going on, and they walk out of therapy feeling super invalidated. It might make them stay. We have to kind of notice what's happening in ourselves. I think if you walk out of therapy feeling certainly invalidated, but more confused, that's got to be a good sign that you're probably not with the right therapist, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a difference between like resistance due to fear and lack of collaboration, or when somebody's like frozen, like in emotional paralysis because of the abuse. But that feels a lot different too than somebody who's just refusing to cooperate and collaborate. Something that might be a good exercise to do is speak with a therapist, do like a consult or something prior to bringing your partner in the room and just saying, this is what I'm experiencing. Hopefully the right therapist will say, yeah, I don't think couples therapy is indicated. I think maybe some individual support for you. But right now what you're describing is you've been kind of beating this dead horse and the person is not, there's no resolution. That's a problem. Like, again, people who have true internal conflicts, they're ego dystonic. The things that are happening to them and the symptoms they're experiencing, they want to rid themselves of them. They want it to go away. Another that's really important to see in a couples therapy dynamic is that it's what's called help rejecting complaining. A personality disorder will reject the help that the therapist offers and then complain that it hasn't been helpful. So that's oftentimes an indication of some pathology. I worked with a couple who the guy would come up with all these excuses why the things I was trying to help him with just wouldn't work. Like, oh, that's just impossible. And then I finally just kind of said, it sounds to me like if none of these things work, then what I'm hearing you say is that this relationship isn't going to work. So this couple ended up getting a divorce, thankfully, because this guy was very narcissistic and unwilling to face it. But apparently throughout the entire divorce proceeding, which was dragged out for years intentionally because, there was a refusal to collaborate, he actually said that the reason he got a divorce was because of me. He was backed into a corner in that session, and I'm the reason his marriage didn't work out. I mean, that's a perfect example of somebody who shows up and he never had an intention of being sincere. He never had an intention of being humble, being accountable. It was really, he came there to see if I would confirm that his wife was the problem. And that happens a lot too, is the help rejecting complaining. It almost seems like they're trying really hard because they're very emotional. And there's this idea that disordered people don't get emotional. No, they're very emotional. They're just emotional in ways that aren't, productive. So we can go all day with all the nuances and things like that. But it's just really important to get some time with the therapist before I think you even enter into the couples thing. Unless you feel safe, Couples who come and feel safe, they problem solve, they do the Gottman stuff, they do the attachment stuff. It gets worked out pretty quickly. I know I'm kind of oversimplifying, but it's true because they're willing to go do it because they don't want to live this way anymore. That's not the case with abuse. The abuse is going to be sustained because the abuser, is benefiting from that.
I think a lot of women go into this thinking that, he's got trauma. Like, we have communication issues because when he was little, his mom used to scream. So if I ever raise my voice, or it just brings him back. So can you help us work through his childhood trauma? And again, if it's a disordered person, they may have trauma. That's not the cause of their behavior, but we think that it is. So what is my question? Like, why does therapy feel like the next logical step for people, even when they know it's abuse?
Here's how the therapist should handle that. If that person has that trigger that's being activated from their childhood trauma, that is not something that's supposed to get resolved in couples therapy. Couples therapy is actually not supposed to be a deep dive into the individual. It's supposed to be, problem solving the dynamic in the relational dynamic. So if that person does have those things, here's how you can out them if they're lying about it, or if it's not really the culprit. They go to individual therapy, they sort that out. If that's really what's the problem, those issues in the relationship should be resolved. That rarely happens. If you send someone with a personality disorder to therapy to work on their childhood, it doesn't make the relationship any better, which tells you that really wasn't the reason why it was problematic, And they're not really willing to do that because I think they know that that's a convenient excuse. It might even be true. Again, these people do come from really adverse environments, but a lot of people come from adverse environments and don't act that way, right?
That's the takeaway, ladies and gentlemen. Like that, it's true. We don't all act this way. So it's not like I don't care about your trauma, but like just we can't lean on that as the cause and the excuse because I mean, man, a narcissistic person will bank on that and pour me the whole way through, and then everything just continues. But I feel like therapy always feels like the next logical step because the world tells you that, your friends, your family. It's like, have you tried therapy? Have you tried? And people are not realizing all of what we're talking about, that therapy is not going to fix an abusive relationship. In fact, therapist Aisha Grevenberg, who I've had on my show before, I love that she said this, and I'm having her back next season to talk more about this topic, is that therapy doesn't fix abusive men at all. We're not talking about couples therapy. She's talking about that's not what's going to help. And she's actually not specifically talking about a disordered person. For her, this is like a sociological issue. This is society. This is the belief system. Your worldview completely needs to change. You need to unpack all of your misogyny. So to me, there's no world in which you send a narcissistic or abusive person to therapy, couples or individual, thinking that that's going to heal them, because it's not really why they're being abusive.
Absolutely.
What do you feel like the audience needs to know here about deciding whether or not they're going to go? I think that there are people we may have convinced and they're never going to go. Some people still will. I would have put myself in that category. You could have told me never to go. I would have gone. So what would you tell people? Make sure you've got the right therapist. What about internally? How can you tell if this is feeling like things are moving forward or not?
I would actually say before you go and seek therapy, I think if this interview crosses your media or you happen to stumble upon it and you are not sure what's going on in your relationship, I would actually get some education before taking the step to therapy. I would read the right books. Maybe you have to go down the rabbit hole of all of these interviews and this kind of content, because you have to broaden and expand the possibilities of what's going on in the relationship. It might not be that you guys just have a communication problem. It might not be that you're just misunderstanding each other, or it might not be that there's unresolved trauma. What it might be is that there's somebody intentionally derailing the progress of the relationship and to maintain control of the relationship, and get really clear on, the terminology and the pathology. And then when you do start to look for therapy, again, the word therapy means to heal. It's about healing. So, you can't heal someone else's wounds in a couples therapy dynamic. That's not how it works. They need to go and take care of that if that's really what it is that's causing the dysfunction. And somebody who is really, not functioning optimally because they're traumatized, they would want to do that because it feels terrible to walk around with trauma. So there might be some resistance and some fear to the process, but that's not lack of collaboration. That's legitimate. But also kind of take inventory of your relationship. Are these enduring patterns of behavior that just will not get better no matter what you've tried, no matter how compliant and small you've gotten in the relationship? You can do a lot of your own work before you go into therapy, thinking that the therapy is going to somehow change, someone in a really profound way. Therapy can change collaborative people in very profound ways. I mean, it can be life-saving.
I'm so pro-therapy, pro-licensed mental health therapy, and I say that as a coach. I think there's space for, all of us to be in this industry, but it is really important for people to know what they're walking into. You said your recommendation would be to slow down before you even get into therapy and do some education. I just want to replug your books here because I truly mean this. There has been very few books that I have read over the last 5 or 6 years that I've been sort of in this field. I could name on really one hand the amount of books that I think are profoundly life-changing things to read. Why Does He Do That by Lundy Bancroft, How He Gets in Her Head by Don Hennessy. And I mean this, all 3 of your books. Top 5. Those books, and I hear from people too. I mean, obviously this is my opinion, but I am constantly hearing from people how life-changing your books have been. And I only recently read Cruelty by Nature because it's new, it just came out. But to learn that it's so on purpose, I think is something that's going to light up people's brains. You're not going to sit there in therapy thinking, hey, we're collaborative, when you realize that somebody who is this abusive and this pathological is literally, I'm oversimplifying, but aware of what they're doing. They understand right and wrong. They know that they're hurting you and they're fundamentally doing it anyway. To me, that's the key that unlocks everything. And it might deter you from going to therapy with them at all, which would be a win in my books. I think so.
Yeah, me too. I just want to, I'll say this because, it might be jarring to hear, but it's an unfortunate reality we have to accept. Abuse is a social strategy for a lot of people. It's not an unconscious reaction to trauma. It's a social strategy. It's working for them. They won't give it up to save their life or their relationship. So if you're with someone like that, I would avoid going to a therapist who assumes that every human being is the same on the inside and they all just want to be better, and then you can find the wound and then problem solved, marriage saved, or relationship saved. I will also say it might be a good idea to, consult with some coaches even before therapy. One of the reasons why the coaching field has blown up in the last 10 years is because of lack of competent care and therapy. There were coaches who were willing to say, hey, something's wrong because we're going to these professionals and they are invalidating my experience. And they're saying that I need to stay with the person who is going to cost me my life. Why are they doing that? And there's been survey data in the last 10 years that's shown that like the forums that people created to try to make sense of what they were going through, kind of have given rise to like this coaching field of like coaches who will blatantly say, I think that person is intentionally doing this, or that person's, a narcissist, where therapists will not be willing to do that. Right.
Yeah.
So there's more options than just traditional therapy,
Yeah. I love that you said that, obviously, but I am so that coach that's like, so that's abuse.
Right.
And a lot of people book with me to ask that question. I have lots of long-term clients, but I also have a pretty good amount of people that are like, this is abuse, right? And I think that therapists are like, well, hold on, we're not going to label. And I'm like, yeah, that's abuse. And I know when I'm oversimplifying things, and I know that there's nuance and context, but I also intentionally and openly, right? I'm not doing this sort of in the shadows of, I'm oversimplifying because I think some of this doesn't need to be so complicated. I'm not a scientist, you're a scientist, that to you. But is repetitiously name calling abusive? Yes. Let's not, well, maybe it's an attachment. Maybe I don't care. So I like I think that's why there's room for all of us. Like, listen to the scientists, but maybe listen to the interviews of both of us collaborating together to bring you this message of couples counseling does not work with this type of person. And if you're going to do it anyway, be as eyes wide open and prepared as you possibly can be before you go into it thinking that this is going to change them. Even them going into solo therapy, like I said, is probably not going to do much, if anything at all. But people are trauma bonded and people are desperately attached to these relationships. So I know it's really difficult for people. And for those that are listening or watching and you don't know, Dr. Salerno and I actually host some group coaching programs. One is called Trauma Bond Recovery and one is called Rise and Rebuild. And I think fundamentally, you've got the group of people that are in or out of the relationship, but actively attached, actively trauma bonded, that want to really learn the true actionable skills to get yourself out with proven methods. And then Rise and Rebuild is for people who are typically out of the relationship, or let's say on their way out at least, who are really like, I've got my PhD in narcissistic abuse and I'm done with the podcasts and the books and I just want to focus on myself and I just want to feel better. And that's what Rise and Rebuild is geared towards. So I'll have the links in the description, and I'm going to put all the links to your books in the description as well, because I really want people to have access to get those and really learn these incredible things from you. So thank you so much for being here today. And
thank you for having me.
Next season, of course.
Yeah, absolutely.